Talk, I'm Eun Jang-cho. North Korea continues to fire short-range missiles and blasts South Korea for continuing to host military drills with the United States. North Korea also angrily rejects South Korea's peace gestures. What's behind North Korea's escalated rhetoric and saber-rattling?
남조선이 그렇게도 안보 위협에 시달리고 있다면 차라리 맞을 짓을 하지 않는 것이 더 현명한 처사로 될 것이다.
I think we'll have another meeting. He really wrote a beautiful 3-page, right from top to bottom, a really beautiful letter.
남북미 모두 북미 간의 실무 협상 조기 개최에 집중해야 할 때입니다.
In the studio with me today, Mr. James Schoff, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment. Mr. Schoff was a Senior Advisor for East Asia Policy to the Secretary of Defense. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Jim, let me begin with you. So North Korea, alongside a slew of its missile tests, short-range missile tests, escalated rhetoric against South Korea for joint military drills with the United States and used derogatory words as well. So why do you think North Korea is escalating rhetoric on South Korea?
Well, it is always very frustrating to me because, in my mind, making a little bit more of a common cause with South Korea would be a better strategy for North Korea, because the Moon government really has made a lot of efforts to improve that relationship and is offering a variety of opportunities. But I suspect the big issue is the fear, essentially, of South Korea. I think North Korea fears two things. It fears the U.S. military strikes potentially from afar, but closer to home, it fears kind of the political, societal potential struggle with South Korea over the long term. So I think it's trying to essentially delegitimize leadership in South Korea and portray itself as the true representative of the Korean people. And I think it's a poor strategy, but it's one that we've seen consistently and really further divides the country.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, President Moon's Liberation Day speech, there were visions for more economic and inter-Korean cooperation between the two Koreas. But why do you think this speech brought out the worst of North Korea rather than cooling down its rhetoric?
Well, I think there are two things that President Moon said that might have been particularly galling for the North Koreans. One was that he publicly asserted that South Korea is stronger militarily than North Korea. And that's very much counter to the narrative that Kim Jong-un has been trying to promote of having become a strong state. And I think the second was providing a date certain for unification, because the vision that he presented was a vision of a South Korean-led unification backed by promotion of regional cooperation. And I think that the North Koreans really didn't like hearing either of those two elements of the speech.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, North Korea repeatedly said that future talks will strictly be with the United States only. So what is North Korea's strategy here by ghosting South Korea?
Well, to some extent, it makes sense to say I only want to talk to the country that lets me do what I want. In terms of the short-range missile tests, it's President Trump who has said, I'm not bothered by this at all, it's no big deal. Kim has actually referenced that when he criticizes South Korea for criticizing them for those tests. And I think, again, North Korea sees the main military threat, or the long-term kind of strategic threat, is the United States. And Trump right now is the opportunity that they have to get some kind of de facto acceptance of their missile and nuclear program. If they can get Trump to agree to something that puts out a kind of a long-term vision for denuclearization, but in the short term essentially allows things to keep going, that would be a big gain for them, and I think that's where they see a potential opportunity and trying to kind of drive a wedge a little bit between South Korea and the United States on that. that
Do
point.
you agree with Jim? Still, the United States is very clear that the goal is FFVD.
Yeah, but I think that from a North Korean perspective, I think that what this gap is showing is that North Korea really wants to replace South Korea as an ally of the United States rather than following the South Korean vision of bringing North Korea over onto the same team. And so that, I think, is very revealing of how North Korea is thinking, and it fits with the traditional longer-term North Korean strategy that somehow if they can just rebuild their strength, displace U.S. forces because they would no longer be needed, and have the U.S. as the backer, it would reinforce North Korea's view of itself as the real strategic pivot, especially between the U.S. and China.
So, Jim, you were advisor to Defense Secretary. What do you make of President Trump's comments that joint drills are ridiculous and expensive? Is this to appease North Korea?
Well, it's very unique to President Trump, I think. Most of the rest of the U.S. government, State Department, Defense Department, Congress, all think that the alliance with South Korea is extremely important, that our exercises are vital to maintaining deterrence, and that they're perfectly reasonable and within the spirit of the current environment and the CMA. But it's Trump himself who is really, first of all, he really doesn't value the alliance as much, and this push on host nation support in Korea paying more. He thinks the exercises are very expensive. They're nowhere near as expensive as they would be if you didn't have bases there. And he's trying to keep his personal relationship going, I think, with Kim as a way and kind of fostering that. But it's very short-sighted, in my opinion, and it's actually causing some division within even the White House itself.
So, Scott, how do you see current U.S. positioning between North and South Korea?
Well, the U.S. is in a rather strange position compared to the past because here we have top-level positive noises between Trump and Kim, and you have seemingly emerging tensions potentially between Trump and Moon. Moon has lost his position as intermediary between the U.S. And North Korea as a result of North Korean vituperation, and yet Moon continues to support the idea of promoting a U.S.-North Korea dialogue. So this is a very odd situation, and I think we'll just have to see how it develops and resolves over the coming weeks.
I mean, to some extent, I think North Korea is really not all that bothered by the exercises, but it's a very useful excuse to be able to pursue its own missile testing program. I mean, it's the series of tests that it's carried out over the past month showed to me that it has a lot of missiles. It's trying a variety of different technologies and techniques and tactics. So this is really a program to improve their capabilities, but they get the benefit of saying, well, we're only doing this because we're upset about your exercises. So it's really in some ways an excuse and cover, I think, for that. So that feeds part of the rhetoric.
Scott, going back to the North Korean rhetoric, after North Korea mocked and criticized President Moon's Liberation Day speech, South Korea came with a very strong response. In a background briefing, South Korea's Unification Ministry officials said that North Korea shouldn't cross the line. So do you think that was the last straw?
Well, no, I don't, because I think that President Moon still retains the publicly stated hope for continued dialogue. I think what we really have to ask is what this change in tone means for what is happening in the internal North Korean debate. We've seen this hardening over the course of the past couple of months focused on South Korea. I think we need to look more at what this means in terms of how groups internally in North Korea may be positioning ourselves and whether we have reached kind of a new phase in terms of how North Korea is thinking about its relationship with the South and the United States.
And Jim, how do you look at North Korea's current rhetoric in connection with the upcoming talks, the nuclear talks between U.S. and North Korea?
I think the North would like to have that conversation with Trump again directly, but the U.S. is going to push for working level talks. We heard National Security Advisor Bolton emphasize that in the last couple of days. And it depends on how resolved Trump will be in kind of demanding that up front. We've seen letters go back and forth, and Trump loves to talk about his beautiful letters. We don't know what's in them, but I would assume there's some element of a private conversation going on between Kim and Trump, trying to get the deal kind of shaped so that the working level feels more comfortable to the North. If they don't get that comfort level, they may push off working level talks for some time.
So going back to the Liberation Day speech, Scott, so President Moon laid out a vision for a joint Olympics at 2032 and then unification at 2045. Of course, this is a vision and a long-term goal, but how does this reflect the current dynamics of very sour relations between the two Koreas?
Well, it directly contradicts the current dynamic because, of course, President Moon's presentation of that vision is premised on the idea that the two Koreas are going to move toward closer cooperation and peaceful coexistence. And the North Koreans have just raised their hand and said, no, we have a completely different way of looking at the inter-Korean relationship. And frankly, the developments over the course of the past year have just been kind of undermined, at least rhetorically. And so the going-in premise that the Moon administration presented of inter-Korean cooperation moving in tandem with improved U.S.-North Korea relations is now being undermined by the North from a completely different perspective from the one that we were looking at last year, where it looked like inter-Korean cooperation was going to move out ahead and U.S.-North Korea relations was going to be the sticking point.
So before I go, Jim, going forward, when North Korea is trying to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington, how should the United States strategize between the two Koreas?
Well, I'm a big believer in the U.S.-South Korea alliance, and I think that really is the centerpiece, and we need to continue to demonstrate that. It was unfortunate, in my opinion, that when National Security Advisor Bolton recently went to South Korea, afterwards we learned that a big part of the message was about demanding more money and host nation support, et cetera. That undermines our solidarity and our joint plan. I think we have an opportunity between Washington and Seoul to give a little bit on our most preferred approach and develop a little bit more of a common approach vis-a-vis North Korea in terms of the denuclearization and sanctions exemptions or some kind of incentive program, and presenting that as our way forward, continuing modest exercises, et cetera, to maintain deterrence. I don't see the Trump administration fully executing that right now. They're doing some things in that regard, and the alliance is still pretty strong so far. But that would be my kind of double down on the alliance and a little bit of flexibility to develop a more common position.
Well, we'll leave our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
I hope that South Korea and I hope that Japan start getting along with each other. You know, they're supposed to be allies.
最大の問題は国家間の約束を守るかどうかという信頼の問題です。
지금이라도 일본이 대화와 협력의 길로 놓은다면 우리는 기꺼이 손을 잡을 것입니다.
South Korea kicked Japan off the list of favorite trading partners following Japan's same measure. As tensions escalate between the two countries, the U.S. is calling for creative solutions. Now, Scott, President Trump called on Seoul and Tokyo to start getting along with each other. When do you think they will start getting along with each other?
Well, don't hold your breath. I think it's going to take some time. The good news is that it seems like we've made a little bit of a turn toward an environment where the situation can be managed. And so I think that the Liberation Day speech that President Moon gave was intended to emphasize cooperation. The fact that the Japanese government has provided some approvals of permits that came earlier than that. Those are both important developments, but I still believe that the fundamental problem between the two sides is that both sides are speaking what they want to say, but they're covering their ears. And so it's very hard for each side to hear what the other needs in order to be able to establish a dialogue that can manage the relationship better.
So as Scott just mentioned, President Moon in his Liberation Day speech reiterated his willingness to speak to Japan over this issue. And how do you think this will be received in Japan?
I think it's being received in Japan with some cautious optimism, or certainly at least some openness to dialogue. But in the speech as well, there were a variety of little digs or criticisms of Japan, and to some in Japan and Tokyo, it sounds like we're very willing to talk with the Japanese as long as they're willing to be reasonable and essentially kind of come to see things our way. I think Seoul would still really like to reverse the Tokyo decision on the export control process. I don't think that's going to happen. I think we've now reached a more, hopefully a stable level, but a more diminished economic relationship between Japan and Korea, which is very unfortunate.
Scott, why do you think Seoul was so quick to remove Japan from its own white list?
I think it was a proportionate retaliatory measure from the South Korean perspective. And frankly, I think the important thing is that it was proportionate rather than allowing this dispute to continue to metastasize to other areas of the relationship. That's something that we really need to see going forward, is some kind of containment on this set of issues. And now both sides have their own ability to kind of gauge what the other side is doing and respond proportionately with regard to managing exports between the two sides.
Mm-hmm. So, Jim, the two countries removed each other from the white list, and also in South Korea, South Koreans are boycotting Japanese products. So, how much are there concerns regarding the damage to the economy, the two economies?
Well, there is plenty of concern. Neither country is kind of the most predominant partner for the other. A lot of important supply chain relationships, and they're still important economic partners for sure. But it's just adding to this more global malaise or global slowdown and instability in markets, et cetera. So it's coming at a poor time. It's about implementation of these export controls now. As long as they're done relatively quickly, professionally, it's still a very minor change from before. Instead of just notifying, hey, we exported this last week, just to let you know, they actually have to get approval before they do it. But in 99% of the cases, there's no reason why trade should not be able to continue as it has. But it's about this trust level and, how do the boycotts progress, and are there other moves in Japan that anger South Korea? So we need to quiet this background noise and let this economic relationship continue.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, ahead of the G7, South Korea officials are already touring Europe to make their own case about this latest incident. And Japan is also planning to explain its position to other countries as well. So what do you make of this diplomatic campaign?
Well, I personally believe it's a waste of diplomatic energy for both sides. They have other more important issues and challenges that they face, and this is really a distraction. It's a time sink. We've got North Korea, we've got China, we've got now Russia being involved in stepping up exercises. And those are big enough challenges. I think that a competition on the economic side between Japan and South Korea is really a distraction compared to the magnitude of the challenge in those other areas.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the issues that are going to be discussed at the G7, how to tax global companies like Google and kind of social media rules, cryptocurrencies, other types of big picture economic issues, these we all have kind of common cause. So I'd rather see Korea, Japan, the United States developing and lobbying for common positions on those important policy issues, not, as Scott says, kind of wasting time trying to promote their own positions vis-a-vis each other.
Mm-hmm. And President Trump said South Korea and Japan not getting along with each other puts the United States in a difficult position. So what is the biggest frustration for the United States?
I think the biggest frustration is that tensions between Japan and South Korea undermine an assumption that the U.S. has as it approaches security in East Asia, that our allies are going to get along with each other. And it actually inhibits the potential for our ability to be effective in East Asia. And of course, the looming larger challenge is the question of how to deal with China's rise. If there are squabbles going on between our allies, it distracts from our ability to deal with that challenge.
Mm-hmm. And State Department called for room for creative solutions to the two countries. So what would that look like?
Well, creative solutions, probably from the perspective of the United States, may not be so practical, but I think the big issue obviously has been the Supreme Court decisions in South Korea on the forced labor victims and families, and solving that is ultimately what needs to happen to improve the relationship. From a U.S. perspective, they would probably say, can you still respect the Supreme Court decision but not necessarily implement it? because it conflicts with international treaties, or could you pay the victims and families yourself first, and then seek other ways with Japan to develop compensation and ways to address this? Or, in my opinion, to be truly forward-looking, can you engage with Japan to really better educate future children populations in Japan about the colonial experience and history, so that we're actually changing the understanding, that there's greater mutual understanding between the two? That's, to me, a truly forward-looking solution as opposed to a more backward-looking solution, which is compensation and the like. So Seoul is not going to want to hear those kinds of creative solutions necessarily, but I think that's what the U.S. has in mind, is somehow getting over that big obstacle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Jim is exactly right. There is hyper-attention to issues of historical memory in Korea, and there is hypo-attention to historical memories issues in Japan, and we really need to see that even out.
Mm-hmm. And Scott, before you go, last question. So do you think President Trump's call for the two countries to start getting along with each other was effective? And would President Trump get more involved in the future if they still do not get along with each other?
I think it was needed. I don't know if it's going to be effective, and I think there probably will be more to be done. The big question really is going to be whether the U.S. is up to the task.
They come out every once in a while to make this effort, but we probably should have been making more of an effort from last year all the way through, and it's going to take a sustained effort, I think, to really have an impact.
Well, we'll leave it here and continue our discussion next time and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of an imitation Coca-Cola and Sprite found in North Korea. Korea Tours posted this picture saying they found this on the train from Pyongyang to Beijing. Business Insider reports Coca-Cola is sold in all but two countries in the world, North Korea and Cuba. Scott?
Well, I guess it shows that Coca-Cola really is globalized, but what I'm really fascinated by is the Korean names here, because it's not Coca-Cola or Sprite, it's the North Korean version. Tansan Tanmul for Sprite with lemon on it. So that's very interesting. It's indigenized, but at the same time, it's a penetration of a global taste into North Korea.
Jim?
Well, I can't help but think that President Trump would be very impressed, and this would kind of reinforce his view that all we have to do is settle things with denuclearized North Korea, and you can have big hotels and the real Coke and the real Sprite, which is what Trump would want to sell, and that there's an appetite in North Korea for modern Western things. Now, whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but I think that's kind of the impression I get from this.
Well, for that to come true, North Korea would have to make that strategic decision that we're waiting for. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Scott, Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.